Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're delving into 3 real blackout horror stories that will make you think twice the next time the lights go out. There's something about being plunged into darkness that brings our deepest fears to the surface, and these true stories reveal just how terrifying a blackout can really be. From mysterious noises to unexplained encounters, these tales are sure to send a chill down your spine. But before we dive into the darkness, I want to thank all of you for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean everything to us. Stay safe, take care, and let's get into these terrifying blackout stories. You never know what might be lurking in the dark. Story 1: When Darkness Intrudes. I had come to think of my home as an extension of myself. Its walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as my heartbeat, its windows like my own eyes gazing out into the world. Each room had a weight to it, a familiarity that grew over the years, embedding itself deep into my mind. It was more than a shelter, it was an extension of my body, a vessel for my thoughts. So when the power went out that night, the house felt dead, as though its heart had stopped beating, leaving me adrift in an unfamiliar world. It began innocuously enough. The day had been long, one of those days at work where the minutes blend into each other, and time stretches out like a tattered curtain. My mind was thick with the mundanity of it all as I returned home. My wife was already there, somewhere in the house, I assumed. The lights were on, and the hum of appliances gave the place its usual sense of comforting normalcy. I expected to slip into the same routine: a quiet dinner, some aimless television, and the slow, methodical drift towards sleep. But something, even in those first moments, felt off. I couldn't name it at first. The air was different somehow. It felt dense, oppressive. The house seemed to close in around me, as if the walls had shifted just slightly when I wasn't looking. I brushed it off, a mere trick of the mind, an effect of the day's exhaustion. But then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness so suddenly, so completely, that it felt like I'd been submerged into some vast, unseen ocean. There wasn't even a flicker, just a total and immediate blackout. I stood frozen in place for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, thick and all-consuming. Even the usual creaks of the house had ceased, as though it too were holding its breath. I stepped to the window, expecting to see the whole neighborhood swallowed by the same darkness. But no, out there, the other houses were still lit, glowing softly in the distance like distant stars. It wasn't a typical blackout. The power hadn't failed. It had been cut. Cold realization began to crawl over me, its fingers tracing my spine. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. I thought of my wife somewhere in the house, unaware of what was happening, or worse, already aware. I needed to find her, to warn her, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A growing dread. It was as if the house itself had become malevolent, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then I saw them, the flashlights. 2 beams of light moving inside the house, my house, cutting through the thick blackness with a casual certainty. They moved like creatures hunting in the dark, weaving through the rooms as though they belonged there. As if I were the intruder, not them. My stomach twisted into knots. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I stood at the window, paralyzed by the sight of those lights slithering through the place that had once been mine. My first thought was my wife. She was somewhere in there, completely oblivious, or worse, what if they had already found her? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. I had to act and fast, but what could I do? I couldn't go back inside. The very idea filled me with an unnatural terror, as if crossing the threshold again would be like stepping into another reality, one where the rules of existence no longer applied. I ran outside instead. The night was cool, but it offered no comfort. The air seemed too still, too quiet. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the darkness beyond the house could swallow me just as easily as the darkness within it. But I didn't care. I had to find a way to warn her. The thought of those intruders, those shadows inside my home with her, filled me with a sickening urgency. The rocks on the ground felt cold and rough in my hands as I gathered them, my fingers trembling. I aimed for the bedroom window where I knew she'd be, and through the first one. It hit the glass with a dull thud, and I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. No movement. No sign that she had heard. I threw another, then another. Finally, the curtain shifted. A shadow moved behind the glass, and then there she was, my wife, standing there, looking down at me with confusion and fear. Her eyes locked on mine, and I could see the dawning horror in them. She understood. I motioned frantically, trying to communicate the urgency of the situation. She nodded, just a slight movement of her head, and disappeared from view. I could only hope she would find a place to hide. I turned and ran toward the nearest neighbor's house. The distance felt immense, like I was running through thick mud, the world around me blurring and warping as my heart pounded in my chest. The power being out meant the phone lines were dead, and my cell phone, of course, had been left charging inside the house, useless now. I reached the neighbor's door, banging on it with a frantic desperation that echoed through the night. It took what felt like an eternity before the door creaked open, and I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. I don't remember much of what I said to them. My words came out in a panic jumble as I explained what was happening, how the intruders had cut the power and were already inside my house. They stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and horror, but I managed to convince them to let me use their phone. I dialed the police with shaking hands, trying to focus, trying not to think about what might be happening inside my home at that very moment. The police arrived quickly, but it felt too late. Time had stretched in a way that felt unnatural, as though hours had passed since I had seen those lights moving through my house, as though I had been removed from the normal flow of time altogether. By the time they entered the house, it was empty. The intruders had vanished into the night, taking with them only a few insignificant valuables. It was as if they had never been there at all. But the worst was yet to come. After the house had been searched, after the police had assured me that the danger had passed, my wife and I sat in the living room, the air between us heavy with the weight of what had happened. She was pale, trembling, but she managed to tell me what she had seen. She had hidden in the closet just as I had signaled her to. She crouched there silent, holding her breath as she heard the soft creak of footsteps approaching. The door to the bedroom had opened slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. She could hear him moving around the room, his breathing heavy and deliberate. She told me how she pressed herself against the back of the closet, her heart pounding in her chest, her body frozen in fear. She could barely breathe, barely think. And then the closet door opened. She said it with a flatness that unnerved me. There was no panic in her voice, no terror, just a cold, detached retelling of the event, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else entirely. The closet door opened, and she could see his shadow looming over her, the outline of his body distorted in the dim light. But he didn't find her, he didn't see her. He stood there, staring into the closet, his eyes scanning the darkness. But it was as though she were invisible, as though she were a part of the shadow itself. He left after a moment, turned, and walked out of the room without a sound. As she told me this, I felt something shift inside me, a deep, unsettling feeling that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't relief or fear or even anger. It was something much darker, much colder. The sense that something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. Not just with the break-in, but with the world itself. I stared at my wife as she finished her story, and for the first time I felt like I didn't know her. Like the woman sitting across from me wasn't the same person I had been married to for years. There was something different about her now. Something off. The police left eventually, and the house was returned to its normal state. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That something had been left behind. Something unseen. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. A creak in the floorboards here, a shadow in the corner of my eye there, but soon it became undeniable. The house no longer felt like mine. It no longer felt like a part of me. It felt foreign, hostile, as though it resented my presence, as though it wanted me gone. And my wife, she had changed too. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes distant, her voice flat. She never spoke about that night again, but I could see it in her eyes. She had seen something in the darkness, something that had left its mark on her. And now it was leaving its mark on me. Story 2: Basement Horrors. It began with a noise. A low, dull thud, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It lingered in the air like a disturbance, an anomaly in the otherwise oppressive silence that filled the house. I had come downstairs to the basement, seeking nothing more than solitude after a day drained of meaning, a night made for quiet reflection. My wife was upstairs, or perhaps already asleep. I wasn't sure. There had been a weight to the air all evening, a sense of something waiting, hanging just outside of my awareness, as if the house itself had become aware of my presence. The basement was not much dimly lit, unfinished, with bare, uneven concrete walls. The small window, too high up for any view of the world beyond, offered only a slice of the backyard and the oppressive storm beyond. The wind had begun to howl with intensity, rattling the windows, pressing against the house as though it was trying to break through. The basement had always been a place I could retreat to, a space of disconnection, of forgetting, where the world above could not intrude. But tonight it felt different. The shadows stretched farther, and the dim flicker of the light above me seemed to stutter, unsure of itself. I had been down here for only a few minutes when the thud came again. This time it was louder, sharper, as though it was meant to be heard. It shook through the wooden beams of the ceiling, reverberated in the hollow space around me, and sank into the pit of my stomach. For a moment I convinced myself it was just the house, a creak of wood, the groan of an old structure under pressure, but I couldn't ignore the way it felt, the way the sound lingered in the air, as if something else was listening. I turned toward the basement window, the only source of light other than the faint glow from the flashlight I carried. The storm was violent, too violent for a simple disturbance of the house's aging frame. There was something unnerving about it, as if the storm was feeding on something, gaining in intensity with every minute. It felt as though the very world outside had become unhinged, and I was caught in its spiral. Then came the flash. The lightning sliced through the darkness like a jagged blade. In that brief, blinding moment, the world outside was illuminated in stark contrast, and through the narrow window above me, I saw a face. A face pressed against the glass, obscured by the torrential rain, its features distorted by the violence of the storm. But the eyes, those eyes wide and unnatural, glowed with a chilling recognition. They seemed to look through me, not at me. They were empty, hollow, and yet filled with a kind of knowing that twisted the pit of my stomach. I blinked. The face was gone. I could feel my breath coming quicker now. I turned the flashlight toward the window, scanning the darkness outside. It was only rain, only the wind. There was nothing. I told myself I had imagined it, that the lightning had played tricks on my mind, that the shadows of the storm had created a hallucination of some kind. But even as I clung to this rationalization, I felt something pressing against me, something tangible, like the weight of unseen eyes in the room. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the normal creaks of a house shifting, not the wind pushing against the walls, but something deliberate, heavy, slow. It was coming from above, footsteps moving in rhythm, coming from multiple directions. First, they came from the hallway above the basement, then the floor above me, moving with methodical precision, as though someone were carefully pacing through the house. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise didn't make sense. It couldn't be the storm or the house settling. These were human footsteps, footsteps that belonged to someone walking with intent, with purpose. someone was upstairs. Someone was here. My first instinct was to shout, to run upstairs and confront whoever it was. But something held me back. The house, dark and silent except for the pounding of my heart, felt oppressive, suffocating. I turned to the flashlight, but the beam trembled in my hand, as though the very act of holding it was too much. I couldn't move. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that instant I heard a voice, muffled and distant, but unmistakably clear. It came from above, and it said my name. My pulse stopped. My breath caught in my throat. How could they know my name? I hadn't spoken a word, hadn't made a sound. The house was empty. Or so I thought. The footsteps above were no longer just intruders, they were something much worse. These weren't strangers breaking in. They were here for me, and they knew who I was. The realization, the cold certainty, settled over me like a heavy cloak. The isolation I had felt before, the unease I had chalked up to nothing, now took on a deeper, more terrible meaning. The intruders weren't just in my house, they were in my life. They were here to disrupt everything I thought I knew. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. The storm had knocked out the power, and with it, any hope of reaching out to the outside world. I tried not to panic, tried not to let the weight of the situation crush me, but the isolation of being trapped both physically and mentally was unbearable. My thoughts raced, my mind a jumbled mess of terror and confusion. I needed to escape. I glanced around the basement, my gaze falling on the small window near the ceiling. Could I fit through it? It was my only option. My pulse quickened. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this house. But before I could move, before I could act, I heard the voice again. This time, it was closer than I had expected. "Are you there?" the voice whispered, soft and malevolent. It was like a presence, something ancient, something that knew me, knew the deep recesses of my being. "I know you're down there." I froze. The words, though barely a murmur, scraped against the walls of my mind, filling every empty space, and suddenly I could no longer think, no longer reason. I had to move. I had to escape. I picked up a nearby pipe, a thick, rusted thing, and brought it down with a force I didn't know I had. The glass shattered, the sound drowning in the chaos of the storm outside. The darkness seemed to swallow the sound whole, muffling it with the relentless rain. I didn't wait. I squeezed through the small window, my body protesting as I fought my way through, the rain pouring down on me, cold and unrelenting. When I landed in the backyard, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran through the wet grass, my feet slipping on the slick earth. But I didn't care. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, and I couldn't stop looking back. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the property, where I found a signal on my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the police, my voice trembling with fear as I explained what had happened. I told them everything, the footsteps, the voice, the knowledge of my name. But by the time the police arrived, there was nothing. No trace of the intruders. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The house was empty, untouched. I couldn't explain it. The house was as silent as it had been before, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that anything had ever happened at all. But I knew the truth. The fear, the paranoia, the knowing that they had come for me, not by accident, but by design, that knowledge would haunt me forever. I stood outside, staring at the house, and the question burned in my mind, what were they? Who were they? Why me? And in the silence that followed, I realized that the answers didn't matter. What mattered was that they were still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. And whatever they were, they would return. Story 3: Echoes of Horror in the Old Warehouse. It's strange how quickly the world shrinks when you're alone. Familiar spaces, once mundane and noble, shift and warp into something other in the stillness of the night. as if they'd been waiting for you, just you, to strip away the layers of their harmless daytime facade. That's what it felt like every night in the warehouse. I started working the night shift at the warehouse about 6 months ago. When I first took the job, it seemed simple enough: patrol the perimeter, check the loading bays, make sure nobody was sneaking in to steal anything. That's what they tell you in the job description. What they don't tell you is that when the world around you becomes quiet enough, when it's just you and the wind, the distant hum of the city, and the silence, you begin to hear things. Small, creeping sounds that scratch at the edges of your mind. The warehouse was enormous. A relic from some bygone era of industry, perched on the edge of town where the concrete gave way to fields of wild grass and the forgotten roads led to nowhere. It was the kind of building that seemed to hold on to everything: dust, memories, lost time. It was filled with towering shelves of industrial equipment, crates stacked high, pallets covered with tarps, and long corridors that stretched further than the eye could see. By day, it was functional, even comforting in its predictability. But by night, when I walked those aisles alone, the place felt wrong. There's no better word for it. I can't say for sure when I first started feeling that wrongness. It might have been the second or third week. I told myself it was just the adjustment to working nights. You lose track of time when the hours bleed together, and the silence becomes oppressive. But there was always something off about the warehouse at night, something I couldn't quite shake. The way the shadows seemed to pool in places they shouldn't, or the way certain corners felt darker than they should have been, even with my flashlight trained on them. It was like the building had a life of its own after the sun went down, a hidden pulse beneath the cold metal and concrete. Tonight, the storm didn't help. The rain had been falling for hours, thick sheets of water that slammed against the metal roof in a relentless rhythm. The wind howled through the cracks in the old framework, rattling the windows and making the whole place groan like a living thing. Occasionally, lightning would flash, momentarily illuminating the rows of shelves and equipment in stark, unnatural light, only to leave everything darker than before. I'd been sitting in the small security office, nursing a cold cup of coffee and half-heartedly watching the grainy feed from the CCTV cameras. There was nothing to see, as usual. It was around midnight when the lights flickered. I looked up, instinctively, at the old fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead. The storm had been getting worse, and it wasn't unusual for the power to go out in this part of town. Still, there was something about the way the lights sputtered, as if the building itself was struggling to stay awake. A few seconds later, they went out completely, plunging the entire warehouse into a darkness so deep it felt tangible. The emergency lights along the exits flickered on, casting a faint, sickly glow across the aisles, but it did little to alleviate the oppressive blackness. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the pounding of the rain against the roof, the distant rumble of thunder rolling through the air. The power outage wasn't unexpected, but the way it happened, the way the darkness just ate the light, it left me unsettled. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk, the beam cutting through the thick shadows, and stepped out into the warehouse. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space, the sound bouncing off the concrete floors and metal walls. I was used to these nightly patrols. The routine was ingrained in me by now. Start with the perimeter, check the loading docks, make sure everything was secure. But tonight, as I walked down the long, empty corridors lined with crates and equipment, I felt that familiar wrongness creep over me again, stronger this time, more insistent. The storm outside seemed to amplify every sound. The rain wasn't just rain anymore, it was a constant, hammering noise, like fingers drumming against the roof, faster and faster, as if something or someone was trying to get in. It wasn't long before I saw a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the rows of towering shelves. It flickered in and out, like a flashlight beam moving erratically, coming from the direction of the loading bays. I stopped, heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it might be one of the workers, maybe someone had gotten stuck here when the power went out, or maybe maintenance had shown up without telling me. But then the light disappeared, swallowed by the dark, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder the longer I stood there. The voices were low, garbled, like a conversation just out of earshot. My skin prickled with unease. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was wrong. Not urgent, not panicked, but deliberate. As if they were discussing something they didn't want me to hear. I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the vastness of the warehouse. "Hello? Is someone there?" The whispers stopped, just like that. The sudden silence was worse somehow, like the air had thickened, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, my fingers gripping the flashlight tightly. Every instinct told me to leave to go back to the security office and wait out the storm. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to know who was there. I made my way down the central aisle, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the rows of crates and machinery. Each step felt heavier than the last, my movements slow and deliberate, as if something unseen was pulling me back. When I reached the loading bay, the area was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no light, no sound. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were wet, irregular, trailing away from the loading door and disappearing into the deeper recesses of the warehouse. The sight of them made my stomach drop. There was no way anyone could have gotten in through that door. It was locked. I had checked it myself at the beginning of my shift. I knelt down, shining the flashlight over the prints. They looked fresh, like someone had been running or dragging their feet. The edges of the prints bled into one another, forming irregular shapes that seemed to writhe and twist under the beam of my light. Next to the footprints, half hidden beneath a stack of crates, was a crowbar. It was slick with rainwater, glistening in the faint light. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no doubt now someone had broken in. Someone was inside the warehouse with me, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I reached for my radio, my hand shaking as I pressed the button to call for backup. But before I could speak, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time they were closer, coming from behind me. I turned, my heart racing, and saw them. Two figures, dressed in black from head to toe, standing at the far end of the aisle. They were motionless, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies unnaturally still. For a moment we just stood there, staring at one another. The air between us felt charged, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then, without warning, they began to move. They sprinted toward me, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor, the sound merging with the relentless drumming of the rain. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I weaved through the narrow corridors, dodging crates and pallets. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting erratic, disorienting patterns of light and shadow. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind screaming through the cracks in the warehouse, as if the entire building was coming apart. The figures were gaining on me. I could hear their footsteps growing louder, closer, until they were almost on top of me. I stumbled, my legs heavy, my body sluggish, as if the warehouse itself was pulling me down, dragging me into its depths. I saw a door ahead, a small storage room tucked between two rows of crates. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged for it, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, listening for the sound of footsteps outside. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of the storm raging outside. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the police, my hands trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. My words came out in a frantic rush, barely coherent, but they assured me they were on their way. When the police finally arrived, the storm had begun to subside. The officers swept the entire warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the remaining darkness, but they found no sign of the intruders. The wet footprints had vanished, and the crowbar was gone. It was as if the entire encounter had been swallowed by the warehouse, leaving no trace behind. My supervisor wasn't exactly sympathetic. I was reprimanded for not doing more to stop the intruders, for not detaining them, for letting them slip away. But I didn't care. There was something far more unsettling at play that night, something I couldn't explain. And every time I returned to the warehouse, I felt it again. That oppressive, lurking presence, watching, waiting. I don't know who or what was in that warehouse with me. I don't know if they were real, or if the darkness had finally crept into my mind, twisting my perception until I couldn't tell where reality ended and nightmare began. But I know one thing for certain. In the warehouse, it wants something. It's waiting for something. And one day I fear it will take it. And that wraps up today's episode of 3 Real Blackout Horror Stories. We hope these tales kept you on the edge of your seat, reminding you just how terrifying the dark can truly be when the lights go out. Thank you so much for joining us on this chilling journey. We couldn't do it without your amazing support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help us keep bringing you these spine-tingling stories, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and remember, when the power cuts out, sometimes it's not just the dark you have to fear. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay vigilant.